Story number 1. The Unseen Presence. I'd like to start by saying I don't believe in ghosts. At least, I didn't before that night, before we drove our RV into the cold, windswept silence of Sheboygan State Park, Michigan. It was supposed to be a quick getaway, a retreat from our busy lives, a chance for 3 friends to kick back and enjoy a few days away from the madness. It was supposed to be a weekend of hot drinks, good food, and endless hours of laughter as the wind howled outside, making us grateful for the warmth of the RV. But, as it always seems to go, things don't turn out the way you expect. That was in December, a few days after Christmas. Snow was already thick on the ground, the kind that looks fresh and untouched but hides its dangers beneath its glistening surface. The air was cold and biting, the kind of cold that cuts right through you, no matter how many layers you wear. But we didn't mind. We were used to the cold. We'd been on enough winter camping trips to know what to expect. The wind, though, it had a bite to it that night, something unsettling, like it was angry at us for being there. But I digress. I wasn't thinking about that when we pulled into the campsite. There were 3 of us, me, Ben, and Sarah. Ben was the adventurous one, always looking for something off the beaten path, always the first to suggest we try something new. Sarah was the practical one, the one who would say, "Let's think this through," and make sure we had all the necessary supplies. Me? I was just there for the ride. I wasn't much for planning, not much for adventure, but it had been too long since we'd done something like this, and I thought it would be nice to get away. We arrived at the park in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the horizon. The trees were bare, and the landscape stretched out before us like a frozen wasteland, the snow covering everything in a blanket of white. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Ben joked about how we were the only ones out here, how the park was basically ours for the taking. But that's the thing about being alone in a place like that. Sometimes, it doesn't feel like you're the only ones. We set up the RV near a clearing. The trees loomed over us like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky. After we finished unpacking, we got a fire going outside, cracking open a couple of beers and settling into the kind of silence that only a winter night can bring. The wind howled in the distance, the kind of wind that makes you grateful to be inside. The warmth of the fire was comforting, but it didn't chase away the gnawing feeling in the back of my mind. Something felt off. We went inside the RV around 9 or so, the cold starting to creep in, even with the fire going. Inside, the RV was warm and snug, the lights dimmed to give everything a soft, cozy glow. We made some popcorn, opened another beer, and sat around the table, talking about life, reminiscing about old times, laughing about stupid things. It should have been perfect. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. It was subtle at first, just a small, nagging feeling, like someone was watching me. I shrugged it off. It was nothing. It was late. We were tired, and I was probably just being paranoid. But then it happened again. The air seemed to change. It wasn't a dramatic shift, just a slight drop in temperature, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I looked at Ben and Sarah, but they didn't seem to notice. They were still deep in conversation, laughing at some stupid story Ben was telling. I felt the chill more intensely then, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. I rubbed my arms, but it didn't help. I glanced over at the window, and that's when I saw it. The door to the RV was open, not wide open, but just enough to let the wind in, enough that the air felt wrong. "Ben," I said, my voice coming out hoarse, "did you leave the door open?" Ben looked up, startled. "What? The door? It's open." Ben turned around and blinked at the door. The wind outside was howling, but the door hadn't been opened. We checked it just a few minutes ago. I watched as he got up and went over to close it. But as he reached for the handle, something strange happened. The door, it closed on its own, like someone had pushed it from the outside. No wind, no nothing. Ben froze. his hand still hovering over the door handle, his face paling. Did you see that? I nodded, but didn't say anything. Couldn't. My throat had tightened up, like I couldn't breathe. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I could feel it now. In the air. In the way the atmosphere seemed to thicken around us. We all sat there, not saying anything, just staring at the door. The wind howled again, louder this time, rattling the windows. And then, from behind us, there came a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. Footsteps. The sound of someone walking, moving through the RV. But we were all sitting right there. There was no one else in the RV. Did you hear that? Sarah asked, her voice tight, almost whispering. I nodded again, my heart pounding. Ben stood up, his face tight with fear. Hello? He called out, but his voice cracked in the middle. The footsteps stopped, and then nothing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I was about to ask what the hell was going on when Sarah spoke again, her voice barely audible. In the mirror. We all turned, following her gaze to the rearview mirror hanging over the kitchenette. First, I didn't see anything, but then, just as I was about to look away, I saw them, figures, shadows. They were standing behind us, in the reflection, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. No one at all. I swear, I could feel their presence, though. I could feel them standing right there, so close I could almost touch them. But when I looked into the mirror again, they were gone. My breath was coming in short bursts now. Okay, that's it, I said, my voice a little too loud. Let's go. But as we scrambled to leave, the air grew colder, and the wind outside howled like it was mocking us. The door swung open on its own once more, and the footsteps started again, louder this time, closer. We didn't wait. We grabbed our coats and rushed out the door, not even bothering to lock the RV behind us. We ran through the snow, heading toward the car, and as we ran, I could feel someone following us. But when I looked back, the RV was empty. The door was wide open, but no one was inside. I don't know how we made it out of there. Honestly, my heart was racing, and I didn't look back once, not even to see if anyone was behind us. We drove away without a word, none of us saying anything about what had happened. There wasn't anything to say. There were no answers. And now, every time I close my eyes at night, I still feel it. That presence. The cold. The footsteps. The feeling of someone standing just behind me. Watching. Waiting. It's been years, but I haven't been able to shake it. We never went back to Sheboygan State Park, and I don't think we ever will. Story number 2. The Silent Watcher. It's funny how things begin. First, it's nothing. A slight shift in the air. A creak of a floorboard. A rustle of branches in the wind. It all feels so small, so insignificant. But in the end, that's what they all are, aren't they? Little things. Little things that grow until they suffocate you, until you can't breathe for them anymore. I didn't know it then, of course, not on that cold, quiet winter night when we parked our RV near the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. But I know it now. I'll start at the beginning. My wife, Emily, and I had always loved the outdoors. The RV was our home away from home, a little sanctuary on wheels, always on the move, and with our 2 kids, Hannah and Charlie, we had made a tradition of spending Christmas Eve in the wild, away from the chaos of family obligations, away from the noise of the world. It was just us, the snow, and the trees, or so I thought. That night, the stars were like ice in the sky. The wind was a soft whisper through the pines, and the air had a sharpness to it that made your lungs burn when you breathed too deep. I remember Emily making hot chocolate for the kids, Charlie chasing after snowflakes outside, and Hannah curled up with a book. We were at peace, a quiet peace, the kind of peace that feels like it's going to last forever. But as the hours passed and the world outside sank deeper into stillness, I felt something shift, not in the world around us, but in the air inside the RV. It was as if the whole place had grown suddenly heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I brushed it off. Just the cold. I thought, maybe the heater was running low. Emily said the same when I mentioned it, offering me another blanket. But even under that warm weight, I couldn't shake the feeling. There was something wrong. Around midnight, I woke up, not from any noise, but from that same insidious feeling that had crept into my bones. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling of the RV, listening to the silence. Complete silence. No wind outside, no animals, no distant calls from the forest. It was like the world had gone mute. And then it hit me. I couldn't hear anything from Emily or the kids either. It was too quiet. I turned my head toward the window and saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow from the trees, or the reflection of the moon. But no, there was someone standing in the snow, a tall figure, perfectly still. It didn't move, not at all, and the way it stood, unmoving, made my skin crawl. The snow around it was undisturbed, no footprints leading up to it. No sound of someone walking in the deep snow, just stillness. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It was still there. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. "Emily," I whispered, my voice thick with the weight of an unspoken fear. But she was asleep, her breathing soft and steady. I reached for my phone, checked the time, 12:03 a.m. A cold shiver ran through me as I considered waking Emily up. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was just the chill creeping up my spine. I stared at the figure. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was a hunter. But why would someone be out here at this hour? In the dead of winter, standing motionless in the snow? The longer I stared, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. The figure didn't even seem human. It was too still, too perfect. The snow around it never shifted. No breath, no movement, just the figure, like a statue, carved into the darkness. Felt like it was watching me, waiting for something. My stomach tightened. I grabbed my jacket, a sudden urgency rising within me. I had to know what it was. I needed to see it closer. And so, without thinking, I crept to the door, slowly, quietly, trying not to disturb Emily. I opened it just enough to slip outside. The night air hit me like a slap, sharp, cold. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stepped out into the snow, every step crunching underfoot, echoing in the silence. My breath hung in the air, each exhale a white puff. I moved closer to the figure, my legs stiff with both fear and the cold. But I couldn't stop. I had to know. As I approached, I called out, "Hey, who's out there?" My voice sounded small in the empty night. No response. The figure didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I stopped a few yards away, just out of reach, and stood frozen. The figure was tall, uncomfortably tall, and though I couldn't make out any real details, I could see the outline of what looked like a heavy coat or jacket. But there was something wrong with its shape. It was too broad, too unnatural. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. My breath grew shallow. I took a step closer. But then, it was gone. Just like that. One moment it was there, and the next it was not. No movement, no sound. It simply vanished into the air like smoke. I blinked, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. But nothing made sense. There was no way a person could have moved that quickly. Not in the snow. Not without leaving a trace. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from tree to tree, trying to make sense of the emptiness. There was nothing, just the snow, the trees, the cold. I stumbled back toward the RV, a sick feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. I opened the door quietly, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. Emily and the kids were still asleep, completely unaware. I sat down on the couch, trembling, trying to calm my breath. What had I just seen? The night dragged on. I lay awake for hours, listening for anything, but nothing came. No sounds of movement, No creaking of the RV. The silence stretched on. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. When morning came, the sun barely broke through the thick clouds. The whole world was still covered in snow. Untouched. Perfect. I didn't say anything to Emily or the kids. Not at first. What could I say? That I had seen something out there in the snow. Something that shouldn't have been there? It didn't make sense. It still doesn't. When we packed up to leave that day, I went outside to check the area where I had seen the figure. There was no sign of anyone. Nothing that suggested a person had been standing there. The snow was pristine, untouched, no footprints, no evidence. And still, to this day, I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was a person or something else entirely, but whatever it was, it's out there, watching, waiting, and every so often, when I close my eyes, I can still feel its gaze on me, silent and cold. I'll never forget it. Never forget the way it stood there, staring, waiting, in the dead of night, and I wonder if it's still out there, in the snow, watching the next camper who dares to sleep under the same dark sky. Story number 3. The Vanishing Trail. We had always been the type of couple that thrived on adventure. The kind of people who enjoyed the isolation of the wilderness, the simplicity of nature, and the idea of getting lost, if only for a few days, away from the noise of the world. So, when Jamie and I decided to take a winter camping trip in Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, Michigan, I knew it was going to be an experience we'd never forget. It was late December, just after the Christmas rush, when we packed our RV and set off toward the rugged, snow-covered landscape. The roads were empty, the trees bare, and the world felt like it was holding its breath. The first day was perfect. The snow had been falling steadily, blanketing the forest in a thick, untouched layer of white. We pulled the RV into a small, remote campsite by Lake Superior, the cold wind off the water biting at our cheeks, but nothing that couldn't be endured with a few layers of clothing and a hot cup of cocoa. We spent the evening cooking over a campfire, chatting about nothing and everything, the kind of quiet where you could hear each other's thoughts, but you didn't have to say them out loud. As night fell, we retreated into the warmth of the RV, the storm outside growing more intense, the wind howling through the trees. We didn't talk much that night. The only sound was the soft crackling of the heater and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. It was the kind of peace that seemed unnatural, like the world had simply pressed pause. The next day, we decided to do something a little more ambitious. We were going to hike the trails that ran along the lakeshore, a part of the park that Jamie had been wanting to explore for a long time. The snow was deep, but the sun had made a brief appearance, casting an eerie light over the landscape. The trail was marked clearly, at least it had been, as we made our way along the path. The only sounds were our boots crunching in the snow and the occasional call of a distant bird. For a moment, it felt like we were the only people in the world, surrounded by miles of frozen beauty. It was about an hour into the hike when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything that could be put into words immediately. It was a feeling, a subtle shift, like the air around us had changed. At first, I thought it was just the cold settling in, or maybe the heaviness of the snow pressing down on us. But Jamie noticed it too. She stopped walking and looked around, her breath misting in the cold air. "Does it feel different to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, but something in the pit of my stomach told me I wasn't imagining things. "Different how?" "I don't know," she said, her brow furrowing. Like we're not on the same trail anymore." I laughed it off at first, telling her that we'd probably just taken a wrong turn somewhere. After all, we were hiking in the winter, and everything looked the same when covered in snow. But when I looked back to where we'd come from, I felt the first pang of unease. The trail behind us had disappeared. The distinct, packed-down snow we'd left behind had vanished, leaving nothing but a smooth expanse of untouched whiteness. "Are you sure we came this way?" I asked, My voice a little tighter than I meant it to be. Jamie nodded, but her uncertainty was evident. We turned around and started walking back, following the vague memory of our footsteps in the snow. But the further we walked, the less recognizable it all seemed. It was as if the world had been wiped clean. The trees, the rocks, even the sky, they were all the same. And yet they weren't. The landscape seemed to shift with every step we took, warping just enough to make it impossible to tell if we were still on the right path. The snow felt heavier underfoot, the air colder, and the silence around us deepened, swallowing every sound. We kept walking and walking. Time seemed to lose all meaning as we retraced our steps. I felt like we were moving in circles, each turn leading us deeper into the unfamiliar. Every so often, I'd stop and glance back, half expecting to see the trail we'd come from. But all I saw was a blank canvas of snow stretching endlessly in all directions. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was like something or someone was following us. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Jamie said, her voice edged with fear. "This isn't where we started. Tom, we need to get out of here." "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We just need to keep going. The RV's not far." But I was lying. I had no idea where the RV was. I didn't even know which direction we'd come from anymore. The woods were different here, the trees taller, the snow deeper. Nothing looked familiar. The trail had disappeared, and with it, all sense of direction. Jamie's breathing had become shallow, her footsteps quickening as panic set in. She pulled at my sleeve, urging me to hurry, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't think we were going to make it. "Tom, please, what's happening?" I didn't have an answer. There was no answer. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the worst thing happened. The crunching sound. Footsteps. They were behind us. At first, I thought it was another hiker. But no, the sound was wrong. It was too deliberate, too methodical, and it was too close. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, or something, approaching us through the snow. But there was nothing, just the trees, the thick white curtain of snow falling all around us. But the sound persisted, a steady, rhythmic crunching, like someone was walking just behind us, always out of sight. I grabbed Jamie's hand, pulling her forward, but the sound followed, closer, closer. It was as if the very forest was breathing, the weight of the snow pressing down on us from every side. The air felt thick, suffocating, like we couldn't escape the growing dread that clung to us. "Run," I whispered. "We need to run." We broke into a panic sprint. But it didn't matter. No matter how fast we moved, the trail seemed to stretch endlessly before us. We ran for what felt like hours, but the landscape never changed. Every tree looked the same, every snowdrift identical. Then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the footsteps stopped. The crunching was gone. The air felt lighter, but something else had taken its place, an eerie silence, like the world had stopped turning. I dared to glance back. There was nothing, nothing at all. No trail, no footprints, no signs of anything having been there. But the feeling remained, the feeling that we weren't alone. Eventually, we stumbled upon the RV, parked just where we'd left it. But it felt like a lifetime had passed since we'd walked away. We didn't say much as we climbed inside, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. I locked the door behind us, and we sat in the darkness. The warmth of the RV a comfort, but a hollow one. Neither of us spoke for a long time. I didn't want to. The silence between us was loud enough. We left the next morning, driving straight through, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. To this day, I don't know what happened on that trail. I don't know what we encountered out there, or why the path vanished. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside, I hear it, the crunching, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too far from the path. Story number 4. The sounds in the snow. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a few friends. A little getaway in the wilderness. A chance to escape the monotony of daily life, to reconnect, and to enjoy the kind of quiet that only winter in Michigan can provide. Manistee National Forest was a place we'd visited a few times before, though never in the dead of winter. It was always peaceful there, so peaceful, could almost be unnerving, like the world was holding its breath. But that was exactly why we chose it. The forest was remote, secluded, and the snow had begun to blanket everything, making it feel like we were the only ones left on Earth. We'd rented a small cabin at the edge of the forest, but it wasn't long before we decided to set up camp by the lake for the weekend, right next to a frozen patch of water. The air had a sharp bite to it, and snowflakes drifted down like whispers from some far-off place. There were 6 of us: Jake, the outdoorsman; Claire, the one who always needed her phone charged; Sarah, the storyteller; Mike, who insisted on bringing his guitar; David, the most skeptical one of us; and me, just the guy who liked to document everything. I took photos of our hike, our tents, and the way the snow clung to the bare branches of the trees like old ghosts. We were all excited about the trip, though there was a quiet tension underneath it. We didn't talk much about it, but we all knew what we were really here for: an adventure. That night, we built a fire and roasted marshmallows. The glow of the flames danced across our faces, and the laughter echoed into the cold night air. The snow had stopped falling for the moment, and the stars above us sparkled like diamonds against the dark velvet sky. Everything seemed perfect, but then came the first sound. It wasn't a crack from the fire, or the wind rustling the trees. It was a crunch, a soft crunch, but enough to make us all stop mid-laugh. We looked at each other, and for a moment, no one said anything. The silence that followed felt wrong. We listened harder. Another crunch, then another. It was coming from the edge of the camp, where the snow piled up in thick layers along the trees. We couldn't see anything, no movement, no shadows creeping in from the darkness. It was as if someone, or something, was walking in the snow, but the forest was empty. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their bare limbs stretched upward, holding their breath. "What the hell?" Jake said, half standing from his seat by the fire. He was the first to speak, but his voice was uneasy. The others followed his lead, rising slowly to their feet. Sarah, who had always been the storyteller, had gone pale. Claire checked her phone, but the screen just glowed in the darkness, no signal. Of course, it was the wilderness. After all, another crunch. This time, it was closer, so close that it sounded like it was right on the other side of our campfire. I looked around, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing, just the flickering flames, the snow, and that terrible silence that followed. "Who's messing around?" Mike asked, a nervous laugh in his voice as he picked up his guitar. He strummed it once, the sound sharp in the stillness, but no one laughed. The crunching had stopped. For a while, we all stood there, listening, waiting. The night stretched on, the fire casting long shadows across the snow. It was too quiet now. No wind, no movement, only the stillness of the trees and the cold, biting air. And then, just as I thought the sound had been some trick of the mind, came again, a single crunch, right outside the circle of light. This time, it was louder, more deliberate, closer. We all turned toward the edge of the camp, squinting into the darkness. The snow was untouched, a pristine blanket stretching out to the tree-line. There were no footprints, no sign of any animal or person, just that strange, echoing sound, like someone was walking in the snow, right next to us. But we could see nothing. My heart started to pound in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was too heavy, too purposeful. "David," Jake said, his voice low, "you go check it out." David's face twisted into a grimace. "I'm not going anywhere," he snapped, though I could tell he was scared too. He was always the skeptic. The one who wouldn't believe in anything unless it was staring him in the face. I couldn't tell if his refusal was out of bravery or fear, but it didn't matter. We were all frozen in place, waiting for something to happen. What? We didn't know. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the crunching stopped again. Dead silence. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then, as if it had never been, the sounds returned. This time, though, they weren't just coming from one direction. They were all around us. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They were closing in, surrounding us. Suddenly, Claire screamed. She pointed toward the trees, her face pale, eyes wide. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the snow-covered branches swaying gently in the wind. But the sound, it didn't stop. It was like something was circling us, moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. My pulse quickened. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice tight with panic. We didn't need to be told twice. Everyone began scrambling to pack up, throwing things haphazardly into bags, not caring how they looked, just moving fast. The sounds were getting closer, louder, more frantic, and yet, when we turned around to look, there was still nothing. But the crunching, it kept moving toward us. Mike, in his haste, dropped his guitar. It hit the snow with a thud, but no one noticed. We were all too focused on the footsteps now. They were so close. I could hear the scraping of boots against snow, the breath of something or someone close enough to touch. I reached out, grabbed Claire's arm, and pulled her toward the RV, where we'd parked earlier that day. The others followed close behind, and we didn't look back. I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket, the fear rising in my chest. But the worst part was the silence that followed us. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the feeling that something was waiting just behind us, watching us, that feeling that you can't shake, even when you're sure you're not alone. We finally reached the RV, and we piled inside, slamming the door behind us. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, but the engine roared to life, and we sped off down the winding path, back toward civilization, leaving the camp and the forest far behind. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, and even then, none of us spoke for a long while. We just sat in the RV, staring at each other, feeling the weight of the night pressing on us. The crunching had stopped, but the air inside the RV felt heavier than it ever had before. There was something in the silence now, a presence we couldn't explain. We never spoke about it after that night. We never went back to Manistee, and to this day, I still hear those footsteps sometimes, crunching through the snow, just out of reach, waiting. Story number 5. The cold spot in the RV. It was supposed to be a family getaway, just a simple winter camping trip to the Hiawatha National Forest in Michigan. My wife, Linda, and I had planned it for months. The kids, Mark and Emily, were both excited about the idea of spending a few days in the woods, away from the usual hum of city life. We'd rented an RV, an old but well-maintained thing, with a heating system that could keep us warm no matter how cold it got outside. The forecast had warned us of a big snowstorm, but we were used to it. We'd been camping in the winter before. Linda and I had taken Mark and Emily up to the mountains a few times, and we figured it would just be another adventure. We'd have hot cocoa, cozy blankets, and each other. The RV was fully stocked, the firewood piled high, and the road was clear when we arrived. By the time we rolled into the Hiawatha Forest, the snow had started to fall heavily. The trees around us, tall and ancient, bent under the weight of the snow, their branches dusting the ground with powder as they swayed. The forest seemed to welcome us with an eerie silence, broken only by the soft whisper of wind moving through the pines. But I didn't think much of it. It was winter in Michigan. After all, the woods always seemed a little too quiet this time of year. We set up camp at a remote spot by the edge of the forest, far away from the crowded parts of the park. I pulled the RV into a small clearing, surrounded by snow-covered trees. The kids were excited to explore, but I suggested we stay inside until the storm passed. The air was cold, and even with the engine running, the chill had crept into the RV's walls. We'd have to wait it out. Inside the RV, the heater hummed steadily, and soon enough, we were all sitting around the small dinette, eating dinner. The kids were talking about school, and Linda and I were making plans for the next day. It was supposed to be a simple evening, quiet, uneventful, but then something happened that I couldn't explain. It started with a subtle shift in the temperature. I'd barely noticed it at first, but as I sat there, a sense of cold began to settle around me, seeping into my bones. It wasn't the kind of cold that comes from the wind outside or the storm blowing through. This was different, unnatural. The heater was on, and it was cranked up high, but the temperature in the RV was dropping. "Mark, can you turn up the heat a little?" I asked, trying to sound casual. I didn't want to alarm anyone. Mark, who was sitting across from me, nodded and fiddled with the thermostat, but it didn't help. The air around me felt like a thick, frozen fog, and the strange cold was growing. Linda noticed it too. "I'm going to check the heater," she said, standing up. I watched as she crossed the small space between the dinette and the control panel. She checked the settings, then pressed her hand to the wall. Her brow furrowed. "Strange," she muttered. "It's fine. It's working just like it's supposed to." But it wasn't working. The chill in the RV had only gotten worse. The cold spot seemed to be centered in the far corner, by the windows right next to the back of the RV, where the shadows fell the thickest. I couldn't explain it. I got up and checked the windows. They were sealed tightly. No draft, no cracks. Yet the air around that spot was like ice. Mark looked at me, a frown on his face. "Dad, it's really cold in there," he said, pointing toward the corner. I told him not to worry, but I felt it too. Something was wrong. I glanced over at Emily, who had been unusually quiet. She was staring at the corner of the room, her eyes wide and unblinking, like she was seeing something that none of us could see. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that made you feel watched. Suddenly, Emily spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "There's someone in the corner." I froze. I turned slowly, trying to keep my expression neutral, but the panic was building in me. Linda, Mark, and I all stared at the empty corner, where the cold seemed to gather like a presence. There was nothing there, nothing at all, but I could feel it now, a weight in the air, something unseen but palpably present. "Sweetheart, what do you mean?" Linda asked, her voice shaking just a little. She didn't want to sound scared, but we all felt it. "I don't know," Emily said, her voice quivering. "I saw something." I moved toward the corner, my heart pounding. As I got closer, the cold intensified, biting at my skin like sharp needles. My breath misted in front of me, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was nothing visible, no figure, no shape, just the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. I reached out my hand, feeling the air. It was frigid, so cold, in fact, that it made my skin sting. I took a step back. "Let's get the kids to bed," I said, trying to steady my voice. I didn't want to scare them, but I needed them to get away from this cold, this presence. We did our best to ignore the growing unease. We turned off the lights and huddled together under blankets in the small, dim space. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, the cold would creep in. Every time I opened them, I saw the shadows in the corner, darker than before, stretching and shifting as if they were alive. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. Linda didn't either. She kept glancing toward the corner, as though expecting something to move. And then, Emily let out a frightened gasp. I turned to her just in time to see her eyes wide with terror. "Mom, Dad, it's back. The thing in the corner. It's moving." I looked over, my blood running cold. The cold spot was still there, but now, it was expanding, as if whatever it was beginning to crawl across the room. The shadows in the corner seemed to lengthen. And from the blackness, there emerged something faint, a shape, barely visible. But there, a figure. Linda grabbed Emily and pulled her close. "It's just a shadow," I said, though I knew it wasn't. It wasn't just a shadow. This was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. I could feel the cold radiating from the corner like it was alive. It wasn't a place, it was a thing. A thing that wanted us to know it was here. The figure faded back into the dark. And with it, the cold receded just a little. But it didn't go away completely. It lingered. The rest of the night passed in fitful sleep. I didn't dare let go of Emily, who clung to me like a lifeline. Linda held Mark, her eyes darting to the corner every few minutes. We all pretended to sleep, but the cold never left. We could still feel it, like it was part of the air, waiting. By the time morning came, the storm had passed, and the sun had risen over the snow-covered woods. But the RV was still cold, cold in that way that made my bones ache. We didn't speak much as we packed up. There was an unspoken agreement between Linda and I. We weren't going to stay another night. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the forest, the snow-covered trees, the emptiness stretching behind us. But there was something more. In the mirror, I thought I saw something. A shadow standing near the edge of the woods, just out of sight. I don't know if it was real, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I do know this: we never went back. And I don't think we ever will. Story number 6. The abandoned RV. It was supposed to be a getaway, a quiet retreat from the noise of our lives. Sarah and I had been together for 5 years. But it wasn't until that winter trip near Michigan's Upper Peninsula that we finally decided to take a break. Just the two of us. The kind of break that forces you to unplug, to leave behind the distractions of work, of social media, and just be with each other. No phones, no obligations, just the deep, welcoming silence of winter and the remote, snow-covered wilderness. We pulled into the deserted campground late in the afternoon. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the winter night wrapped itself around us like a cold, invisible cloak. The temperature was dropping fast. But that didn't matter. The RV was warm and cozy, and we had everything we needed: blankets, food, the kind of hot cocoa that warms you from the inside out. After we set up camp and settled into our RV, we decided to head outside for some fresh air and to cook a simple dinner. It was only a short walk to the clearing where we'd be cooking. But as we bundled up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the kind of off that you could put your finger on. It was just a subtle, nagging sensation at the back of my mind. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation of the place playing tricks on me. The night was dark, save for the weak light of our lantern. The trees surrounding us like towering shadows. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we made our way toward the clearing. We set up our little cooking station, Sarah humming under her breath as she prepped some vegetables. I was making the fire, the smell of burning wood filling the crisp air. That's when we saw it. At first, I thought I was imagining things, the outline of something large and metal looming in the distance. Just beyond the trees, I could barely make it out through the snow. But I knew that it didn't belong. There was no reason for a vehicle to be out here. The campground had been closed for the season. No one should have been around for miles. I pointed it out to Sarah, and she squinted through the dimming light, trying to make sense of it. "What is that?" she asked, her voice sounding a little too calm for the oddity we were seeing. "I don't know," I replied, my heart picking up its pace. "Let's check it out." We didn't even need to discuss it further. Something pulled us toward it. An unspoken curiosity, a need to understand. We walked closer, stepping carefully in the snow, the crunching sound louder now, almost mocking the stillness of the woods. As we got nearer, it became clear that it was an RV, a big one, not dissimilar to our own. It looked out of place, like a relic from another time. The paint was peeling, the windows frosted over with layers of ice. But what struck me as odd were the windows. They were all tightly shut. Sealed shut. I tried to peer inside. But the darkness beyond the glass was absolute. No light. No movement. Felt lifeless. "Why is this here?" Sarah whispered, her breath fogging in front of her. "It shouldn't be." I nodded, agreeing with her unspoken suspicion. It made no sense. There was no reason for our RV to be left out here, especially one that looked as though it had been abandoned for years. The campground was closed. No one had been supposed to come here. "Maybe someone's just parked it here for the night," I suggested, though even I wasn't sure if I believed it. But my thoughts were already clouded by the strange atmosphere surrounding the RV. The eerie stillness of the woods, the biting cold air, and the fact that we were the only ones around for miles. It made my skin crawl. We circled around the RV, looking for a sign of life, anything that could explain its presence. The door was locked tight, no signs of wear, no indication of recent use. We both paused when we saw something strange, fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the RV. I bent down, inspecting the tracks. They were odd, larger than the average boot print, and they didn't seem to match any shoe or boot I recognized. Almost like they were too perfect, too even, like they'd been made by someone who knew exactly where they were going. But they didn't go anywhere else. They didn't loop back. They just stopped, as if whoever had left them had simply vanished. "Let's go back," Sarah said, her voice tight. "This doesn't feel right." She was right. We didn't need to say more. The sense of being watched, of being observed, was getting stronger. The air itself seemed charged with something I couldn't explain. I glanced back toward the RV one last time. The emptiness inside the windows felt suffocating. "Yeah, let's go," I said, my voice betraying a tremor I hadn't meant to let slip. We made our way back to our campsite in silence. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. But it wasn't from the cold. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and we had just brushed up against it. That night, we tried to shake off the feeling. We retreated into our RV, locked the doors, and tried to enjoy a quiet evening by the fire. We ate, we talked, we laughed, trying to ignore the nagging sense that something was wrong. But even as we tried to settle in, I could still hear the wind howling outside, the rustling of trees, the faint whispers that seemed to float on the breeze. Eventually, sleep took us, though it didn't come easily. I kept waking up, the darkness of the night pressing in on me. Each time, I would listen, trying to hear if anything had changed, if that feeling of being watched had dissipated. But it hadn't. The stillness felt too heavy. And then, in the early morning hours, we were woken by a sound, a faint tapping at the window. I sat up, my heart immediately racing. I glanced at Sarah. She was still asleep, oblivious to the sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I quietly pulled back the curtain to peer outside. Nothing, just the snow, falling steadily in the gray light of dawn. But as I looked, I realized something. The RV was gone. Gone. I blinked, trying to process it. There had been no sign of anyone coming or going. The snow hadn't been disturbed. It was as if it had never been there at all. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself. I shook Sarah awake, showing her the empty spot where the RV had been. Her face was pale as she scrambled out of bed to look. "It was just here," she whispered, almost to herself. "We saw it last night." "I know we did." I nodded, still unable to comprehend what had happened. We spent the next few hours looking around the campsite, retracing our steps. But we found nothing. No tire tracks, no signs of movement, no remnants of the RV's existence. It was as if the vehicle had vanished into thin air. We left soon after. We packed up our things in silence, both of us too unsettled to speak. The feeling that had clung to us since we first saw the RV still lingered, like a cold hand at the back of our necks. We never spoke about it again. Not to each other. Not to anyone else. The mystery of the abandoned RV stayed with us. But we couldn't explain it. And that's the worst part, the not knowing. To this day, I don't know what happened out there, but I do know one thing. Something doesn't want people out in that campground. And whatever it was that we stumbled upon, it didn't want us to find out. It didn't want anyone to find out. And maybe, just maybe, it's still out there, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. Story number 7. The Mysterious Lights of Lake Michigan. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip. One of those nights where we'd park the RV by the lake, grill some burgers, and drink beer under the cold, crisp winter sky. No big deal, right? We had all the usual camping gear, firewood, blankets, a few bottles of whiskey, and no idea what we were getting ourselves into. Started like any other evening, except that the snow had begun to fall heavier than usual. I remember the way the flakes drifted lazily down, settling in layers on the frozen ground. The world around us was becoming muffled, wrapped in a blanket of white. We were in good spirits, laughing and joking as we huddled around the fire, trying to keep warm. The RV was parked on the edge of the woods, just a stone's throw from the icy shoreline of Lake Michigan. It was a peaceful spot, far from the city lights, or so we thought. There were 6 of us, me, my brother Josh, and a few of our friends. We'd all made this trip at least once before, but tonight was different. I couldn't have known it at the time, but it was the kind of night that would change everything. The kind of night that makes you question the world you thought you knew. We were standing outside, letting the fire flicker out, our breath visible in the icy air. The wind was picking up, but not enough to put out the warmth of the fire. I felt a strange sort of peace, one of those quiet nights where everything feels right. That's when I first noticed the lights. They were faint at first, small, distant, almost like headlights in the far distance, hidden behind a veil of snow. My first thought was that it was someone else out here, maybe another RV camper or a truck on the road. But there was no road close by. Lake Michigan stretched out in front of us, the shore silent and untouched, save for the snow. No cars, no houses for miles. "Hey, you guys see that?" I asked, pointing toward the glow. Josh looked up from his phone. "What's that?" he asked, squinting into the night. The lights flickered, pulsed for a moment, and then vanished, just like that. No trail, no fading glow. 1 second they were there, and the next they were gone. We all stood there in silence. I glanced at the others. No one said anything. I wasn't sure if it was just the cold messing with our eyes or something else entirely, but it felt wrong. "Maybe it's just a trick of the light," said Rachel, one of the girls in the group. She sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than us. I mean, it's pretty dark out here, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't shake the feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Without another word, we all decided to check it out. Stupid, I know, but that's what we did. Walked toward the shoreline, the snow crunching under our boots. At first, the snow seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary. The ground was packed hard, the lake frozen solid. But then, just as we were about to turn back, the lights reappeared. This time, they were much closer. They moved slowly at first, like they were watching us, closing the distance between us and the shore. It wasn't like any headlights I'd seen before. There were no beams, no cars on the road. These lights floated in midair, glowing softly, hovering above the snow. They didn't flicker, didn't flash. They just moved, like they were being controlled by something unseen. I remember feeling a strange pull toward them. It wasn't like curiosity, it was more like an instinct. I had to get closer. The others must have felt it too because they started walking faster, eager to get a better look, or maybe to confirm what we were all seeing. And then they disappeared again, just like before. The lights vanished in the blink of an eye. There was no sound, no movement, nothing. For a moment, we all stood there in stunned silence, staring at the empty night. My breath came faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to go back to the RV," Josh said, his voice strained. This is messed up." We turned around, but something had changed. The air felt colder, heavier, as though we were no longer alone in the dark. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, the figures. They weren't human, at least, not in any way I could understand. They stood just at the edge of the trees, their shapes faint, like shadows dancing in the mist. No faces, no details, just tall, thin silhouettes, barely visible against the night. The snow was too thick to make out their features, but I could feel their eyes on me, on us. I looked over at Rachel, who was walking ahead of me. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. "Did you see that?" I whispered. She didn't answer, but I saw her glance behind her, and that was enough. We all knew. We were being watched. And then came the wind. It started as a faint breeze, brushing past us like a whisper, but then it grew stronger, a gust so cold. It felt like it came straight from the heart of the lake itself, pressed against my skin, cutting through my jacket, biting into my bones. Felt alive. The wind wasn't just cold, it was intentional. And then the figures stepped forward, one by one, emerging from the shadows, walking toward us. I could feel their presence more than see them, like a pressure against my chest. "Run," Josh muttered, barely audible, his voice tight with fear. We turned and ran back toward the RV, not stopping to look back. The snow seemed to get deeper with every step, pulling at our feet, like the ground itself was trying to hold us back. My legs burned, and my breath came in sharp gasps as I pushed forward. Faster, faster. We finally reached the RV, slamming the door behind us and locking it. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My heart was racing. I looked out the small window, half expecting to see those shadows standing there, just beyond the light of the RV. But they were gone. The rest of the night was a blur. We huddled inside the RV, the wind howling outside. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen. We knew what was out there in the dark. But the worst part came when we tried to leave the next morning. We packed up our things quickly, eager to get away from the lake, from the woods, from whatever it was that had been watching us. But when we drove back down the path, there was no sign of the lights, no trace of the figures, no indication that anything unusual had happened at all. No footprints in the snow, no lingering scent in the air, nothing. It was as if it had all been a dream. But I knew better. We never went back to that lake. We never spoke about it again. But I can't shake the feeling that something that isn't human, still watches us from the shores of Lake Michigan. And one day, when the snow falls again, it might come looking for us.